Welcome back. This is part four. We're going to be looking at the new Americans, how they're assimilating, and are they running into some of the old challenges as well? So, when we look at current immigration here in the United States, America finds itself in a new era. The traditional minority groups, Black Americans, African Americans, whatever you'd like to call them, Mexican Americans, and others, have been joined by new groups from places that most Americans could not find on a map. Armenia, Zimbabwe, Bhutan, Guyana, and Indonesia, to name just a few. Over the last 4 decades, well over 30 million newcomers have arrived, a rate that exceeds the pace of the first mass immigration. And the question is, will this new wave of immigrants transform the United States once again? And this really lies at some of the issues that are plaguing us today. If you think about Armenians, Zimbabweans, Bhutanans, Guyanans, and Indonesians, they're mostly coming from that refugee position, or at least an extremely impoverished position. And so that really warrants the question of how will they change the United States in the future? If we look at legal immigration to the United States from 1960 to 2013, it's consistently been on the uptick, really spiked in the Bush administration, and then began its downward decline during the Obama administration. These new Hispanic groups that are coming into the country are predominantly coming from the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, and Colombia. This more recent wave of immigration is much more diverse than the first two. In 2012 alone, immigrants arrived from more than 200 separate nations, from Afghanistan and Albania to Zambia and Zimbabwe. The sending nations for these immigrants are economically less developed, and most have long-standing relations with the United States. These immigrants tend to be more educated, more urbanized, and more skilled than the average citizens of the nations from which they come. And immigrants from the Dominican, El Salvador, and Colombia have made up 7 to 9% of the immigrants in recent years, and about 30% of the immigrants from Central and South America and the Caribbean. These folks are most visible in our sporting choices, especially baseball. The arrival of Dominicans, El Salvadorians, and Colombians have certainly become visible because many of your favorite baseball players are from these countries. These groups have had few members in the United States before the 1960s, and all have had high rates of immigration over the past 4 decades. Dominican immigrants are motivated largely by economics, and they are especially concentrated in the service sector. El Salvador, like the Dominican Republic, is a relatively poor nation. So many of the folks coming from there are making economic decisions as well. Many of the Salvadorians in the United States today are actually political refugees. Colombia is somewhat more developed than most other Central and South American nations, but it has suffered for more than 40 years due to internal turmoil, civil war, and government corruption. And of course, we probably didn't help a whole lot when we waged the war on drugs in Colombia and went down there. And whether you agree with their economic decisions, we certainly took an economic engine away from them by eradicating the poppy fields throughout Colombia, and the marijuana fields and whatever illicit drugs were coming out of Colombia. Colombian Americans are closer to U.S. norms of education and income, than other Latin or Latino groups, and recent immigrants are a mixture of less skilled laborers and well-educated professionals. Of course, Mexico is still leading the way with the number of legal immigrants from the top 25 sending nations: China, India, the Philippines. The Dominican Republic is certainly moved up the scale, all the way down to Egypt, who gives us very little. Two of the largest non-Latino groups immigrating to the United States are coming from Haiti and Jamaica. Both of these are Caribbean nations. Both nations are much less developed than the United States. And this is reflected in the educational and occupational characteristics of the immigrants that are coming from these areas. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Estimated 80% of the population lives below the poverty line in Haiti, and less than 1/3 of adults hold formal jobs. Less than half the population is literate, and Haitians average less than 3 years of formal education. One of the reasons they're moving is because, notwithstanding the extreme poverty, was a massive earthquake in January 2010, which intensified the difficult conditions in Haiti. Needless to say, it's going to take years for them to recover. Jamaicans tend to be more skilled and educated and represent something of a brain drain. Jamaicans typically settle on the East Coast, particularly in New York City area. What I mean by a brain drain is the more skilled and educated are leaving Jamaica and coming to the United States, leaving them with less educated, less skilled people. Some characteristics of the three top Hispanic groups in 2012. Percentage with less than high school diplomas: non-Hispanic whites 8.9%, Asian Indians 9.3%, Koreans 7.6%, Filipinos 7.4%, and Vietnamese 29.7%. Sorry, folks. I think that the title of this slide is incorrect, but we're not looking at the top three Hispanic groups in 2012. We are looking at 4 Asian American groups and non-Hispanic whites. Percentage of college degrees, of course, non-Hispanic whites 31.9%, Asian Indians 69.6%. On down to 25.9% of Vietnamese. And you can imagine that their median household incomes are going to follow suit, and percentage of families living in poverty as well. Immigration coming from Asia has been considerable since the 1960s, averaging close to about 300,000 people, or about 40% of all immigrants. Sending nations are considerably less developed than the United States, and the primary motivation for most of these immigrant groups is improving their economic situation. We also know that many Asian immigrants are refugees from wars, and others are spouses of the U.S. military. Immigrants from India, Vietnam, Korea, and the Philippines, they make up about 500,000 of the immigrants coming from Asia. Immigrants from India, Vietnam, Korea, and the Philippines, as we mentioned earlier, make up about half of all immigrants from Asia. 4 groups considered here are small, and they all include a high percentage of foreign-born members. They're quite variable in their backgrounds, their occupational profiles, their levels of education, and their incomes. Like the immigrant stream from India, South Korean immigrants include many middle-class, more educated, professional people, many of whom were pushed from their homeland by a repressive military government. The 4 groups vary in their settlement patterns, and most are concentrated along the West Coast, but Asian Indians are roughly equally distributed on both the East and the West Coasts. and Vietnamese have a sizable presence in Texas, in part related to the fishing industry along the Gulf Coast. You can begin to understand why in the United States it feels like the East and West Coast are much more diverse than in the Midwest. It's because that's where these folks go. Immigration from the Middle East and the Arab world began in the 19th century, but it's never been particularly large, and they've primarily been a relatively hidden population. The earliest immigrants tended to be merchants and traders in the Middle Eastern countries, or in the Middle Eastern community in the United States, which has been constructed around an ethnic small business enclave. So these Asian Americans or these Arab Americans are landing in the middle part of the country. The number of Arab Americans and Middle Easterners has grown rapidly over the past several decades, but it still remains a tiny percentage of the total population. This is a diverse group which brings different national traditions and cultures as well as religion, which is one of the reasons why they're discriminated against. 9/11 was an extremely important event to this group of people, where prejudices existed in the past. They were not extreme prejudices, but post 9/11, Arab Americans have felt the pain and suffering of prejudice and discrimination being directed at them by the dominant white population. So faint shade of prejudice directed at Middle Easterners has always existed, as I mentioned to. But when the World Trade Centers went down, Americans responded to the attacks by Arab terrorists with an array of emotions that including bewilderment, shock, anger, patriotism, deep sorrow for the victims and their families. And although the 19 attackers were from Saudi Arabia, this increased prejudicial rejection of Middle Easterners, Arabs, Muslims, and any other group that vaguely associated with the perpetrators of the attacks on 9/11. Today, the Arab American community still faces a number of issues and problems, including profiling at airport security checks and greater restrictions on entering the country. Therefore, although the Arab American and Middle Eastern communities are small in size, they have assumed a prominent place in the attention of the nation. And because of that, they've been victimized by a strong stereotype that is often applied uncritically and without qualification. Relations between Arab Americans and large society are certainly among the most tense and problematic in any minority group. Immigration from Africa has been quite low over the past 50 years. However, there's been an unusual increase after the 1960s, and Africans have made up about 5% of all immigrants in the past few years. The number of native Africans in the U.S. has more than doubled since 1990, and this rapid growth suggests that these groups may have a greater impact on U.S. society in the future. The category of sub-Saharan Africa is extremely broad and encompasses destitute black refugees from African civil wars and relatively affluent white South Africans. Nigerian and Ethiopian immigrants tend to be highly skilled and educated, and they bring valuable abilities to the table. Nigeria is a former British colony, so the relatively high levels of English fluency is not surprising, and it's looked on favorably. Compared with Nigerians, Ethiopians rank lower in the English fluency and are more mixed in their backgrounds. Although Ethiopians compare favorably with national norms in education, they have much lower levels of income and therefore much higher rates of poverty.